I was 52 years old when my own mother smiled at me like I was already buried, and that moment didn't arrive loudly or violently. It arrived wrapped in politeness, perfume, and polite folding chairs borrowed from the church down the road, because she wanted witnesses. She always wanted witnesses. And as I stood there in the living room where I had taken my first steps, learned to ride a bike in the driveway, and carried my father's coffin shoes through the front door years earlier, I realized how strange it was that a man could live more than half a century and still feel like a child waiting to be judged. And I remember thinking how unfair it was that I had paid mortgages, raised kids, buried friends, survived layoffs, rebuilt properties after storms, and yet in that room I was suddenly reduced to a cautionary example, a lesson to be taught, not a son to be loved. And my mother stood near the fireplace with her hands folded just right, the same way she used to fold them during church testimonies, chin lifted, voice steady, that voice she used when she wanted people to believe every word came from a clean place. And she told everyone she had called this gathering to announce a final family decision, and I felt something cold move through my chest, because nothing good ever follows the word final when it comes from someone who enjoys control. And she didn't rush, she took her time. She talked about faith and sacrifice and obedience, about how families need order, about how parents are chosen by God to lead, and I could see heads nodding, church friends smiling politely, cousins shifting their weight, neighbors pretending not to listen while listening anyway. And then she turned toward my younger brother, the golden one, the traveler, the dreamer who never stayed long enough to clean up messes, and she said the estate would belong to him, the house, the land, the rental properties, every brick my father laid, every fence post I replaced, every tenant call I answered at midnight, all of it, handed over like a reward. And my brother didn't even look surprised, just satisfied, like a man hearing confirmation of something he already believed was his. And then she turned toward me, and I will never forget that smile, because it wasn't angry, it wasn't cruel in the obvious way, it was pleased, like she had finally won something she had been working toward quietly for years. And she said my name slowly so no one could miss it, and announced that I was cut off forever, not temporarily, not until I apologized, but forever. And the room reacted before I did, a sharp intake of breath, a chair scraping, someone whispering my name like they were afraid I might fall over, and I stood there feeling oddly calm, like my body had decided to step aside and let my mind handle it. And she kept talking, because she always keeps talking when she thinks she has the upper hand. She spoke about loyalty and respect, about children who honor their parents, and children who challenge authority, and she framed it like a moral lesson, like God himself was standing behind her nodding approval. And what she didn't know, what she couldn't know because she had already decided who I was in her story, was that my phone in my pocket was recording every word, not out of anger but out of instinct, because years of being the responsible one had taught me to document first and react later. And what she didn't know was that the deeds she believed she controlled had already been transferred legally and quietly after months of careful preparation, signatures collected, timelines respected, rules followed to the letter. And what she didn't know was that the meeting she thought was her victory lap, her moment to publicly erase me, was actually the moment everything shifted, because power built on assumptions collapses the second reality walks into the room. And when she finally stopped talking, when her words ran out and the silence grew heavy enough that people stopped pretending to sip drinks and started really looking at me, I saw her confidence flicker, just for a second, because she expected tears or anger or pleading, something that would confirm her control. And instead I stood there calm, steady, breathing slow. And in that quiet I realized something that would change me forever, that truth does not rush, it waits. And when I finally spoke, when I lifted my head and met her eyes, her smile disappeared, not because I raised my voice or accused her, but because she recognized something she hadn't planned for, the sound of a man who was no longer asking for permission to exist. And as the truth began to surface, calmly, clearly, without drama, it became obvious to everyone in that room that this was not the ending she had imagined. And that was the moment I understood that the deepest betrayals don't come with shouting or slammed doors, they come with smiles, folded hands, and a sentence spoken slowly enough for everyone to remember. And that was the moment my life split cleanly into before and after, because nothing about me would ever kneel the same way again. I didn't grow up angry, and that part matters more than people realize, because anger would have at least explained what came later. But anger wasn't my starting point. Loyalty was, the kind of loyalty that forms quietly in a kid who learns early that being dependable earns approval faster than being loud. And from as far back as I can remember I was the older son who stayed close, not because I was forced to but because it felt natural, like gravity, like this invisible agreement that someone Had to be steady and that someone was me. So when my father worked double shifts and came home exhausted with paint on his boots and worry on his face, I was right there beside him fixing fences, patching roofs, repainting rental units between school days and summer heat, learning the difference between doing a job fast and doing it right. And when my mother volunteered at church, which was often, I drove her without complaint, sat through long meetings, helped set up chairs, listened to conversations that never included me, because being useful felt like belonging. And when my younger brother messed up, skipped responsibilities, missed deadlines, or burned bridges, I was the one who smoothed things over, made excuses, paid small debts, fixed what he left broken, not because anyone asked me to, but because chaos made me uncomfortable and order felt like love. And I remember leaving town once in my 20s, just once, chasing a job opportunity that promised more money and a wider horizon, and for a brief moment I tasted what independence felt like, the quiet thrill of not being needed every second. But it didn't last, because the calls started coming. My parents said they needed help, the properties were growing, paperwork was piling up, my father's health wasn't great, and there was an unspoken expectation in every sentence, the kind that doesn't demand but assumes. So I came back without much argument, telling myself it was temporary, telling myself family comes first, and that temporary decision stretched into decades, years where I put my own life on hold without ever officially deciding to. I married late because there was always something that needed fixing first, a tenant issue, a tax deadline, a roof leak, a family emergency. I skipped chances because stability felt more important than risk, and I stayed nearby handling repairs, tenant complaints, taxes, permits, late-night calls, early morning inspections, becoming the quiet engine behind everything the family owned, the man whose name rarely came up in public praise but whose fingerprints were on every working part of the machine. And while I was doing that, my brother was living a completely different story. He left early and stayed gone, moved from place to place, job to job, always chasing something bigger, something shinier, and he'd pop back in for holidays with new clothes, new cars, big smiles, and bigger stories about the next big thing, the deal that was about to land, the plan that was just around the corner. And my mother adored him in a way that felt both obvious and untouchable. She called him bold, said he had vision, said he reminded her of my father when he was young. And every time she said it I felt something twist inside me, not jealousy exactly, but confusion, because the father I knew valued consistency, patience, and follow-through, qualities my brother rarely displayed. Yet somehow the story kept changing, and when my father passed, everything shifted in a way I wasn't prepared for. Grief does strange things to people. It rearranges memories, sharpens old preferences, and gives fear a louder voice. And my mother became sharper, more controlling, leaning heavily on religion, but not the gentle kind that comforts and forgives, the kind that justifies authority and silences questions. And she began rewriting history right in front of me. Conversations I remembered clearly were retold differently. Decisions my father and I had made together were suddenly described as mistakes, and slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, my role changed in her narrative. My brother became the dreamer my father supposedly believed in, the son with the future, while I became difficult, questioning, too independent, a problem to manage rather than a partner to trust. And every time I pushed back, every time I asked for clarity or fairness, it was framed as disrespect, as disobedience, as proof that something in me had gone wrong. And still, despite the growing discomfort, despite the tightening rules and shifting stories, I stayed, because family is family. Or at least that's what I told myself, over and over, convincing myself that endurance was the same as love, that patience would be rewarded, that if I just kept showing up, kept fixing things, kept holding everything together, eventually she would see me the way I had always hoped to be seen, not as a threat, not as a problem, but as the son who never left. And I didn't realize until much later that staying doesn't always make you valued, sometimes it just makes you convenient. And that was the foundation being quietly laid beneath everything that would later explode in public, because long before I was cut off with a smile, I had already been pushed aside in ways that didn't leave visible marks. And loyalty, I would eventually learn, can be used against you just as easily as love can. The first real warning sign didn't come with shouting or threats. It came disguised as a favor, which in hindsight makes sense because control works best when it wears the mask of care. And my mother asked me one afternoon if I could help reorganize the property paperwork, titles, deeds, tax records, all the boring but important stuff I had handled for years. And she said it was just for simplicity, for her peace of mind. Said she was getting older and wanted everything neat and easy in case something happened. and because I was still operating from loyalty instead of suspicion, I agreed without hesitation, thinking this was just another quiet responsibility to carry. But as I sat at the dining table surrounded by folders and files, something started to feel off in a way I couldn't immediately explain, like a room that looks familiar but smells different, and the more I sorted, the more inconsistencies appeared. Old documents missing that I clearly remembered filing, copies where originals should have been, new papers drafted but never signed. And then I saw my brother's name showing up in places it hadn't before, penciled in lightly, almost casually, like someone testing how it looked. And when I asked about it, just a simple question at first, her tone changed instantly, not angry, but sharp, defensive, and she said I didn't trust her, said that questioning your own mother showed a lack of faith, and that hurt more than if she had just yelled, because she wasn't arguing facts anymore, she was attacking my character. And every follow-up question I asked after that was met with the same response, that I was being disrespectful, that I was reading too much into things, that I should stop acting like an outsider. And that was the moment something clicked in my head that I didn't want to admit out loud, that love had quietly turned into leverage, that the affection I thought was unconditional had conditions attached that were only now being enforced, and from that point on, access became a weapon, access to information was limited, documents were suddenly off limits, decisions were made without me and explained later as done deals, and approval, which I didn't even realize I had been chasing, became something dangled just out of reach. So every conversation felt like a test I didn't know the answers to, every visit felt like an evaluation, every disagreement was framed as a moral failure. And while this was happening, my brother started showing up more often, not openly involved, but present enough to be seen, whispering with her in the kitchen, stepping outside with her to talk, making plans that were already in motion by the time I heard about them. And it was clear I was no longer part of the inner circle, if I ever truly had been. And then came the idea of the church meeting, which she presented as something wholesome and healing, said she wanted to share testimony with friends and family present, said it was about gratitude and closure, about honoring my father's legacy and moving forward. And everything in me resisted it, not loudly, just quietly, a feeling in my gut that this wasn't about healing at all, but performance. And I almost didn't go, told myself I could skip it, that I didn't need another gathering where I felt invisible. But something held me back from staying away, a sense that absence would be interpreted as guilt, that if I didn't show up my story would be told without me. And so I decided to go, but with a different mindset than before. I told myself not to argue, not to defend, not to correct, but to listen, really listen, to what was being said and how it was being said. And that instinct, the decision to observe instead of react, ended up saving me, because in those quiet moments leading up to the meeting, as I watched how carefully things were being arranged, who was being invited, what language my mother practiced out loud, I finally understood that this wasn't a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a conversation. It was a strategy unfolding slowly, patiently, counting on my silence, my loyalty, and my reluctance to make a scene. And once I saw that clearly, once I accepted that the love I had relied on was now being used as leverage against me, I stopped feeling confused and started feeling focused. Because there is a strange kind of calm that comes when you finally understand the rules of the game you've been playing without knowing it. And from that moment on, I knew that whatever happened next, I would not be walking into it blind. I didn't confront her, and that decision wasn't born out of fear or confusion, it was born out of clarity. Because once you understand that someone is no longer speaking to resolve things but to control them, confrontation becomes useless noise. So instead of arguing, instead of defending myself, instead of trying to correct a story she had already rewritten in her own mind, I prepared, quietly, carefully, and without announcing a single move, because preparation is what people do when they finally stop hoping and start accepting reality. And the first thing I did was consult a lawyer, not some aggressive courtroom personality looking to burn bridges, but a calm, methodical professional whose first question wasn't how do you want to fight this but what exactly do you want to understand. And that question alone told me I was finally in the right room, because what I needed wasn't revenge yet, it was knowledge. And as we went through the details piece by piece, property by property, document by document, I learned something that shifted my entire sense of power, which was that the estate wasn't as simple or as settled as my mother believed. Some properties were still legally tied to my father's estate because certain steps had never been finalized. Some required consent from multiple parties that had never been obtained. Some depended on signatures that were assumed to exist but didn't. And suddenly the image she had been projecting of absolute control started to look more like a carefully balanced illusion, and more importantly than any document or technical detail, I learned that the work I had done for decades mattered in ways I had never been taught to recognize, that managing properties, handling finances, maintaining assets, and acting as the operational backbone of the family business had given me standing, legal standing, not emotional leverage or moral arguments, but real, tangible recognition under the law, and that realization didn't make me angry, it made me steady, because for the first time I understood that my value didn't depend on her approval or my brother's absence. It existed independently of how they felt about me. And somewhere in that process I learned something else that would later prove critical, which was that words spoken in public carry weight beyond the moment they are spoken, that public declarations create records, expectations, and consequences, especially when they involve assets, authority, and intent, and that understanding reshaped how I saw the upcoming church meeting. It wasn't just a family gathering anymore. It was a stage, and stages have rules whether people realize it or not. So I planned, not emotionally, but structurally. I transferred what I could legally transfer, following every rule, every deadline, every requirement, making sure there were no shortcuts that could later be questioned, because patience allowed me to be precise, and precision is far more dangerous than speed, and I documented everything. Conversations that used to live only in memory were written down. Promises that had once been spoken casually were logged with dates and context. Contradictions that might have been dismissed as misunderstandings were recorded side by side so patterns became undeniable. And I recorded the meeting legally, not out of spite but out of necessity, because I had learned that truth without proof is just an opinion, and opinions don't survive contact with authority. And through all of this I didn't rush, I didn't brag, I didn't hint, I didn't give myself away with anger or bitterness, because real revenge isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself or posture for applause. It waits. It lets the other side grow comfortable, confident, careless. And while my mother rehearsed speeches and my brother imagined a future already secured, I stayed silent and let them underestimate me. Because silence isn't weakness, silence is space. And in that space I built something stronger than an argument, stronger than an accusation. I built inevitability, the kind that doesn't explode but settles in, the kind that doesn't shout but stands firm. And by the time anyone realized what was happening, the foundation had already been poured, cured, and reinforced, and all that remained was the moment when preparation would meet performance. And when that moment came, I knew I wouldn't need to raise my voice at all. I didn't confront her, and that decision wasn't born out of fear or confusion, it was born out of clarity, because once you understand that someone is no longer speaking to resolve things but to control them, confrontation becomes useless noise. So instead of arguing, instead of defending myself, instead of trying to correct a story she had already rewritten in her own mind, I prepared, quietly, carefully, and without announcing a single move, because preparation is what people do when they finally stop hoping and start accepting reality. And the first thing I did was consult a lawyer, not some aggressive courtroom personality looking to burn bridges, but a calm, methodical professional whose first question wasn't how do you want to fight this but what exactly do you want to understand. And that question alone told me I was finally in the right room, because what I needed wasn't revenge yet, it was knowledge. And as we went through the details piece by piece, property by property, document by document, I learned something that shifted my entire sense of power, which was that the estate wasn't as simple or as settled as my mother believed. Some properties were still legally tied to my father's estate because certain steps had never been finalized. Some required consent from multiple parties that had never been obtained. Some depended on signatures that were assumed to exist but didn't. And suddenly the image she had been projecting of absolute control started to look more like a carefully balanced illusion, and more importantly than any document or technical detail, I learned that the work I had done for decades mattered in ways I had never been taught to recognize, that managing properties, handling finances, maintaining assets, and acting as the operational backbone of the family business had given me standing, legal standing, not emotional leverage or moral arguments, but real, tangible recognition under the law. And that realization didn't make me angry, it made me steady, because for the first time I understood that my value didn't depend on her approval or my brother's absence. It existed independently of how they felt about me. And somewhere in that process I learned something else that would later prove critical, which was that words spoken in public carry weight beyond the moment they are spoken, that public declarations create records, expectations, and consequences, especially when they involve assets, authority, and intent. And that understanding reshaped how I saw the upcoming church meeting. It wasn't just a family gathering anymore. It was a stage, and stages have rules whether people realize it or not. So I planned, not emotionally, but structurally. I transferred what I could legally transfer, following every rule, every deadline, every requirement, making sure there were no shortcuts that could later be questioned, because patience allowed me to be precise, and precision is far more dangerous than speed, and I documented everything. Conversations that used to live only in memory were written down, promises that had once been spoken casually were logged with dates and context, contradictions that might have been dismissed as misunderstandings were recorded side by side so patterns became undeniable, and I recorded the meeting legally, not out of spite but out of necessity, because I had learned that truth without proof is just an opinion, and opinions don't survive contact with authority. And through all of this I didn't rush, I didn't brag, I didn't hint, I didn't give myself away with anger or bitterness, because real revenge isn't loud, it doesn't announce itself or posture for applause, it waits, it lets the other side grow comfortable, confident, careless, and while my mother rehearsed speeches and my brother imagined a future already secured, I stayed silent and let them underestimate me, because silence isn't weakness, silence is space, and in that space I built something stronger than an argument, stronger than an accusation. I built inevitability, the kind that doesn't explode but settles in, the kind that doesn't shout but stands firm, and by the time anyone realized what was happening, the foundation had already been poured, cured, and reinforced, and all that remained was the moment when preparation would meet performance, and when that moment came, I knew I wouldn't need to raise my voice at all. When she announced it, she expected me to beg, and I know that now with a clarity that only comes after the shock wears off. She expected my shoulders to drop, my voice to crack, my pride to fold in front of everyone she had carefully gathered as witnesses. She expected tears because tears would have confirmed her power, apologies because apologies would have restored her control, submission because submission would have completed the picture she had already painted in her mind, and when none of that happened, when I didn't rush to defend myself or interrupt her speech, when I didn't even shift my weight or clear my throat, the room began to feel strange in a way people couldn't quite name, because silence is uncomfortable when it isn't paired with shame, and I stood there calm, not frozen, not numb, but present, aware of every sound, every breath, every glance being thrown my way, and I let her finish because people reveal more about themselves when they think they are untouchable. I let her enjoy the silence because she had earned it in her own way. She had worked toward that moment for a long time, rehearsed it, imagined it, believed it would be the end of me, and when she finally stopped speaking and waited for my collapse, I did something she never expected. I thanked her, and the word hung in the air awkwardly, confusing her and everyone else, because gratitude doesn't belong in moments like that unless something has gone terribly wrong with the script, and I told the room that I respected her decision, not as a trick or a performance, but as a statement of fact, because respect doesn't require agreement. And then I said something even more unsettling. I said that I believed truth mattered, that transparency mattered, and that families, especially families that mix love and property, should never operate in the dark. And as I spoke I could feel the shift, not dramatic, not explosive, but subtle, like a tide changing direction, and then I pulled out the copies I had brought with me, not dramatically, not slamming them on the table, but calmly, one stack at a time, deeds, transfers, legal notices, documents that carried more weight than any sermon or accusation, and I explained what had already been done, slowly, clearly, without emotion. I explained what was already in motion, what steps had been taken legally and properly, what timelines had been followed, and what could not be undone no matter how loudly someone objected, and I reminded her, gently but firmly, that ownership isn't declared in living rooms, it isn't granted by speeches or smiles or moral arguments. Ownership is documented, it lives on paper, in records, in filings, and as those words settled, the room changed in a way no one could ignore. My brother's face strained of color because for the first time he realized he had been promised something that was never fully hers to give, and my mother's smile cracked, just slightly at first, then completely, as the weight of reality pressed in on the story she had been telling herself, and in that moment the betrayal became undeniable, not because she had cut me off, but because she had tried to do it publicly, confidently, without knowing the ground beneath her feet had already shifted, and I stood there realizing that betrayal isn't always loud or violent. Sometimes it arrives dressed as certainty, and sometimes the most painful part isn't the loss of approval or inheritance, but the realization that someone you trusted believed you would never stand up, never prepare, never speak when it mattered, and as the silence deepened and eyes moved from her to me and back again, I understood that this wasn't just the end of an illusion for her, it was the end of the version of myself she thought she controlled, because in choosing to betray me so openly, she had unknowingly given me the one thing I needed most, the moment where truth could finally step forward without interruption, and once that happens, no amount of authority can pull it back. People started asking questions, not the polite kind people ask to fill silence, but real questions, the kind that come when something important no longer makes sense. Questions about dates, about decisions, about who knew what and when, and each question felt like another crack forming in the version of events my mother had carefully presented, and she tried to interrupt, not loudly at first, just small interjections, corrections, dismissive laughs meant to regain control, but I didn't raise my voice and I didn't insult her, because I had learned that volume is often used to hide weakness, and I had no reason to hide anymore, so I just explained, slowly, clearly, grounding every answer in facts instead of feelings, and every time she denied something, every time she said that wasn't what she meant or that I was misunderstanding her intentions, I calmly played her words back, not to embarrass her, but to anchor the room in reality, her own voice saying the things she now claimed she hadn't said, her own promises spoken casually months earlier when she thought no one was keeping track, her own contradictions stacked gently but firmly on top of each other until they could no longer be ignored, and the truth didn't shout its way through the room, it didn't accuse or demand attention, it waited patiently while people processed what they were hearing, and then it stood, solid and unavoidable, like something that had always been there but had finally been given enough light to be seen clearly, and I could feel the shift happening in real time, not dramatically, not all at once, but person by person as heads stopped nodding along with her and began turning toward me instead, as whispers turned into thoughtful silence, as the room recalibrated its understanding of who was speaking from authority and who was speaking from habit, and when I finished explaining, when there was nothing left to clarify or replay or document, no one clapped, no one cheered, no one rushed to fill the space with noise, because applause would have cheapened the moment, and they didn't need to make a sound to acknowledge what had happened, because silence itself had shifted sides, and in that silence I felt something settle deep inside me, a calm certainty that whatever happened next, whatever conversations followed, whatever relationships changed or ended, the balance of power in that room had already been rewritten, not through aggression or humiliation, but through patience, preparation, and the quiet strength of letting the truth speak in its own time, and in that stillness I understood that moments like this don't feel like victory while you're inside them, they feel heavy, sobering, almost sad, because you're watching an old story collapse in front of people who believed in it, but once the room turned, once the truth stood without being challenged, there was no going back, and I knew with absolute clarity that the silence surrounding me now was no longer that silence of being ignored, it was the silence of being heard. My brother left early, slipping out with that carefully rehearsed air of someone who believed the performance had gone as planned, and the moment the door clicked shut behind him, the room felt smaller, heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, and my mother, who had stood so confidently just minutes before, finally sat down, shoulders slightly hunched, hands clasped in her lap, a crack appearing in the armor she had spent decades perfecting, a crack that ran deeper than anyone in that room, including me, could see at first glance, and the church friends, the neighbors, the cousins, those who had come expecting to witness the grand unfolding of humiliation, avoided eye contact, shuffled uncomfortably, whispered quietly among themselves, realizing in subtle, almost imperceptible ways that the narrative they had been told for so long was not accurate, that the story they had believed about who was loyal, who was deserving, who had earned what, was being rewritten. Quietly but irrevocably before their eyes, and within weeks, lawyers got involved, not because I had raised my voice or because I had launched some vengeful attack, but because reality, meticulous, patient, legal, and undeniable, had arrived and forced itself into the open, documents filed, transfers recorded, signatures verified, timelines laid bare, and suddenly the elaborate web of control my mother had constructed over decades, the careful crafting of appearances, the selective sharing of information, the subtle encouragement of my brother's ambition and simultaneous diminishment of my own contributions, all of it began to unravel in the presence of fact and law, and the estate, which had seemed like a single, unassailable fortress in her mind, was divided legally, fairly, quietly, with no spectacle, no dramatic gestures, no public condemnation, because there was no need, because truth, once properly documented, has its own authority, and she lost control, not because I had taken it from her with force or anger, not because I had humiliated her in front of friends and family, but because she had abused the trust that comes from love and loyalty. She had assumed that obedience and quiet diligence could be exploited indefinitely, that others' patience could be leveraged for her own security, and when you abuse trust, especially that which is earned over decades through selflessness and quiet effort, the foundation beneath you crumbles, slowly, subtly, but completely. and I watched as the consequences unfolded, the gentle rebalancing of authority, the acknowledgement by others that the story had always been more complicated than she let anyone believe, and I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sorrow, because the fall wasn't joyous. It was inevitable, a demonstration not of triumph but of principle, and I understood deeply in that moment that power without trust is always temporary, that controlling through fear, manipulation, or selective praise only works until the facts arrive, and when they do, the facade dissolves, leaving only the raw, unembellished reality. And in those weeks, while lawyers did their work, accounts were clarified, deeds were confirmed, and conversations were recorded, I witnessed the shift of influence and authority that had been quietly brewing for years. The subtle recognition by everyone involved that what mattered was not who could shout the loudest or appear the most confident, but who had earned credibility through patience, preparation, and an unwavering adherence to truth. And my mother, once the orchestrator of every narrative, the unseen hand guiding perceptions, was now confronted with the reality that manipulation, no matter how skillful, is fragile, and that respect and trust cannot be demanded, they can only be cultivated. And when she realized that, when the quiet gravity of her loss settled in alongside her pride, there was no denying it, she had built power on shifting sands, and the weight of her own choices had brought the collapse she had long feared but never admitted, a collapse that was complete in its silence and absolute in its consequence, leaving a ruin, a family, and a legacy that now had to be reckoned with honestly. And in that reckoning, I finally understood the ultimate lesson, that authority and control are meaningless without integrity, that influence built on deceit and exploitation will eventually be reclaimed by the one who holds the facts, and that the quiet, persistent, patient son who had never left, who had never demanded, who had quietly documented, observed, and understood, would always outlast the fleeting triumphs of arrogance and manipulation. I didn't celebrate, and that was deliberate, because victory, when it comes at the cost of illusions and years of quiet sacrifice, doesn't feel like fireworks. It feels like a heavy settling, a pause where the weight of what actually happened presses down and forces reflection. And I grieved, not for the money, which I had long since realized was only paper and property, numbers on forms and deeds that carried value only when recognized, but for the illusion of love, support, and mutual respect that had been carefully constructed in my mind and carefully dismantled in reality, because I had spent decades believing that loyalty, hard work, and presence were the currencies of a healthy family, that showing up quietly, handling responsibilities, and protecting my father's legacy were the marks of devotion that would earn recognition, gratitude, and eventually trust. And yet in the quiet aftermath, as the room emptied, the lawyers concluded their work, and the estate settled into legal order, I realized something painfully clear and entirely unavoidable, that some parents don't want children, not really, not as individuals with needs, desires, and boundaries, but as followers, as mirrors of their own ambitions, extensions of their ego and authority, willing participants in a narrative that benefits them alone. And all the affection, all the encouragement, all the early lessons about loyalty, obedience, and faith had been subtly redirected into a system where my compliance was expected, my questions discouraged, my independence viewed as a flaw. And when that compliance was no longer automatic, when I refused to kneel, to step aside, to accept erasure quietly, they called it betrayal, framed my self-preservation and legal diligence as defiance. And in those moments, the harshest realization settled in, that the person who gave life may not always give recognition, that love can be conditional, and that sometimes the hardest truth isn't that you were denied, it's that you were never truly seen as an individual at all, only as a placeholder in someone else's story. And I sat quietly in the house that had been the stage for both my erasure and my reclamation, and looked at the walls that had held decades of family history, the photographs that had once seemed warm now seemed brittle, staged, and filled with shadows of expectation rather than genuine memory. And I understood fully that what remained after all the legal filings, the reconciliations forced by fact, and the silences that followed wasn't celebration or triumph, it was clarity, the unflinching awareness that my presence had always mattered in terms of contribution, reliability, and diligence, but never in terms of unconditional acceptance, that some bonds are transactional even when they call themselves familial. And then I had lived long enough to learn the painful difference between being loved and being useful, and that realization carried a weight that no inheritance, no property, and no courtroom victory could offset, because when the illusion finally fell away, I was left not with a sense of having defeated anyone, but with the sober understanding that my endurance, patience, and careful observation had preserved not just the estate, but the truth about who I was. And in that truth, though bitter and slow, there was a power far greater than wealth or approval, a power that no sermon, no smile, no proclamation could ever revoke, and in that quiet, reflective moment, I felt both the emptiness left by betrayal and the strength left by integrity, understanding that life's most important inheritance isn't measured in titles or deeds, but in the unwavering recognition of your own worth, the ability to stand, to observe, to act when the moment demands, and to accept that some will never see you for who you are, only for what you can provide. And the grief I carried was not over the loss of money or position, but over the loss of belief in the illusion, over the recognition that sometimes the people we call family value obedience above individuality, and love above loyalty, and that the quietest, most painful victories are the ones where you survive not just legally or materially, but with your soul intact, knowing the difference between being wanted and being used, and that awareness, though heavy, though lonely at times, remains forever, a constant reminder that truth, preparation, and patience are worth far more than smiles, applause, or temporary admiration, because in the end, reality respects only what is genuine, and nothing else survives in the long light of consequence. I'm 52 now, and for the first time in decades I sleep well, not because I won in the way people expect, not because I stood above anyone or humiliated anyone or collected applause or approval, but because I didn't lie, because every word I spoke, every action I took, was anchored in reality, in fact, in the meticulous care of observing, documenting, and understanding the truth. And there is a peace in that which cannot be measured by wealth or acknowledgement or any external measure. Because when you act honestly, when you align yourself with reality instead of someone else's version of it, you carry a calm that is immune to gossip, immune to manipulation, immune to the fear of being erased. And if you're listening to this, and if you feel that weight, the suffocating sense of being overlooked, dismissed, or written out of your own story, I want you to understand this, understand it deeply, because I learned it the hard way over years of quiet labor, silent endurance, and patient observation. Silence isn't weakness, and it's not submission. It's the pause you take to understand the terrain before moving, and preparation isn't cruelty. It isn't plotting revenge in the vulgar sense. It is respect for the process, for the law, for reality itself. And when it finally comes time for action, that preparation becomes the framework through which justice and truth can operate. And above all else, truth doesn't need permission to stand. It does not wait for approval. It does not bend to fit someone else's narrative. It merely exists and grows stronger every time you recognize it, document it, and allow it to speak for itself. And sometimes, the calmest voice in the room, the one that does not shout, does not demand attention, does not beg or plead, is the most dangerous one of all, because that calm is grounded in knowledge, in patience, and in unshakable alignment with reality. And when it finally rises, when it finally chooses to speak, it cannot be ignored or silenced. It carries weight not because of volume but because it has authority, and that authority does not need to be granted by anyone, not even by those who once tried to erase you. And as I reflect now, decades older and finally aware of the limits of both loyalty and control, I understand that the greatest victories are quiet, that the moments that truly define you are those spent in preparation, patience, and observance, that the moments you hold yourself accountable to truth, even when the world seems stacked against you, are the moments that build the foundation of your integrity. And if you ever find yourself in a room where someone is attempting to rewrite history, erase contributions, or punish independence, remember this: you do not need to justify your presence, you do not need to beg for acknowledgement, you do not need to perform submission to prove your worth. And the calm, steady, deliberate act of holding to reality, of speaking carefully when the time is right, of allowing truth to emerge on its own timeline, is more powerful than anger, more effective than confrontation, more lasting than any forced apology. And when you finally recognize that, when you accept that the measure of a person's integrity isn't in applause or recognition but in fidelity to truth, you understand why I sleep well at 52, why I feel grounded despite decades of manipulation, why I carry a sense of quiet authority that no one can take away. And that lesson, that awareness, is the inheritance I would give anyone who has been erased, overlooked, or silenced, because in a world that constantly rewards the loudest voice, the boldest performance, and the most performative loyalty, it is the calm, patient, unshakable commitment to truth that is the quietest but most undeniable form of power, the kind that lasts long after smiles fade, after declarations are made, after applause dies down, because truth, once recognized, once documented, once allowed to stand, will outlive everything else, and nothing, not authority, not manipulation, not even time itself, can erase it.